There's a fire in love. There's a fire in love.
Check 1 2 1 2. There we go. Let's get cam going. Perfect. Let's turn down, as per usual, the music in my own headphones. There we go. That should be good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another class. In this case, Story 1 and 2. Today we're learning about character development, how to create a character from scratch, and make them worthy of any story that we might be writing. From what I can see, chat is a little bit light today. No worries, that's what the video on demand, that's what my uploads to YouTube are for. Hopefully some people make their way in sooner rather than later, but we'll see. Sometimes life gets in the way. So what I have planned today is I have a few pieces of good news to share, not personal news, just good news from around the world. I'm going to try to make this a habit from now until the end of this class. Beyond that, we have a nice little lecture, and then finally a PDF handout that goes along with an assignment for my properly enrolled students. So, to get started, and while we hopefully get more people coming into chat, I'll get started with a bit of good news. Here we go. Also, let me get rid of that guy there. There, perfect. So the first piece of news I want to start out with, and all of this is on Canvas for my students, is that there is a new service out there for Zoom meetings, for group collaborations, that kind of thing. And this service allows you to add a farm animal into your Zoom call. Personally, I don't know why I might choose to do that, but it could definitely make for a couple of laughs, that's for sure. So this company called, where is it? GoToMeeting, a play on GoToMeeting, a company that stages teleconferences. This company lets you basically rent out the time of a goat, a turkey, a sheep, a pig, a llama, etc. To participate in your company meetings. Or in some people's cases, maybe classes. Please don't expect a goat to suddenly show up in this stream. But it looks like a lot of laughs, and who doesn't want to say hi to a llama every once in a while? I never thought I'd say that sentence in my life. But moving on, easily my favorite piece of news that I've lined up today it's a video, which I'm not going to play, copyright reasons, but I highly recommend checking it out on the Good News Network. It's a short article about a group of nuns, the Drukpa order of Buddhist nuns, in Nepal, who are the only group of nuns in all of Nepal, at the very least, to practice martial arts. They're essentially kung fu nuns, which, if that doesn't work as the plot of a kung fu movie, I don't know what would. But I checked out the video. It's a very cute little video, very well cut together, a good narrative. A very good example of finding a silver lining in everything that's going on, or just a unique human interest story that's worth telling. So I highly recommend checking it out for my students who are on Canvas. I have a link there called Kung Fu Nuns. For my students who just happen to pop in through the ether, you can check it out at thegoodnewsnetwork.org. Beyond that, what else is new? Let's talk about some media. So the cast of Parks and Rec got together for a reunion episode, which is on YouTube, Hulu, a few different places, I believe. The episode centers around the idea of what the characters of the show are doing all these years later to deal with COVID, what their lives are like. And so this episode was released as a fundraiser to help with COVID-19 relief, and they raised more than $3 million. So essentially the way it worked was all the, there were all sorts of donations, and the first $500,000 worth of donations would be matched by the show's producers, network, cast, etc. Everyone chip in, and then anything extra was just the fans donating. So they raised over $3 million, which is awesome. And it's completely online for free. You can check it out again on YouTube. You can find it through the link on here, but you could also probably just Google it. Finally, a bigger piece of news, a bit more explanation needed. An Italian student that was stranded in Spain finds a hero in a cab driver who drove her 900 miles home for free. This is not all of the story. So this student, she is an Italian student who is studying abroad in Spain. When the coronavirus outbreak happens, lockdown happens, quarantine happens, etc., etc. She has no way to get home. She managed to get a flight out of the town she was in to, I believe it was... Yeah, she managed to get a flight from Madrid to Paris to Rome, then to Venice. But essentially restrictions kind of forbade part of that flight. So through serendipity, she came across a friend of hers, a friend of hers contacted a taxi driver, and this 22-year-old man named Kepa. I am not great with pronunciations. He not only went and picked her up and drove her to where she needed to be, which was a 9-hour drive from Bilbao to Madrid and back, but he didn't charge her a dime. No money charged for any of it. Unfortunately, they were blocked from entry. Her apartment was no longer available. So he invited her to stay the night with him and his family. The next day, they sorted out a way to get her back to Venice, another 1,500 kilometer flight or drive. Called the authorities, got all the authorizations, etc. He gave her that ride too. So in total, she received a 3,000 kilometer trip from this lovely cab driver, and he didn't charge her a penny, saying, quote, "I don't want to get advantage of you. I see you are in a difficult situation. Don't worry about the cost." And, well, this story is being shared all over the place. So it's a really good example of the best of people coming out in situations like this. So those are the 4 stories I have. We have the Goat 2 meeting, with goats taking part in teleconferences. We have the Kung Fu Nuns. We have Parks and Rec coming back for a reunion. And we have a wonderful Italian cab driver. For those who are on Canvas, you can find these on Canvas. For those who aren't, all of these stories come from the Good News Network, which is where I'm going for just like that little bit of uplifting news every day. So, moving on. It seems we have a couple more viewers jumped in chat, a few more students, which is awesome. Thank you for joining us. So, for those who did miss it, today we're talking about how to develop a character from scratch, and I'm going to dive right into it. We'll try to keep this short and sweet. So, let's There we go. So, character development, pretty straightforward. Real quick, last lecture, we talked about using media values to decide whether stories were worth telling or not. And we talked about finding the silver lining in tragedy, and this is when I assigned you your photo essay assignments. After that, last class, we looked at how to set the pace of a video with slow motion. And we talked about how speed affects emotion within a video. It was a pretty casual class. We just went through some techniques on Premiere Pro, some video editing techniques. This week, we're going to pretty straightforward talk about building a character and then talk about the assignment that goes with that. We'll talk about things like developing characters' motivations, their conflicts, their strengths. We'll talk about other tips that other things we might want to consider when building a character. So, the thing to ponder for today, feel free to shout it out in chat. Feel free to just keep it to yourself. Think about what it is that makes a character. What makes a person a person? What makes a character a character? There's also all sorts of correct answers there. So, the things to consider when we sit down with a story and say, I need to fill this up with characters. Building a character is all about getting inside their head. It's about understanding them better than anyone else. At the same time, you need to be aware of how the bigger story around them affects them. Because you could build a very specific kind of character and then set them in a world that doesn't suit them whatsoever. And either they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, or they're going to adapt to fit their surroundings, like anyone would. And that's a consideration you need to make as a writer. Again, whether you're writing a story or whether you're writing a novel or whether you're writing a screenplay, it's all the same. Character development is the same across the board, except maybe for the sake of casting if you're doing live action. This can be it can be very difficult to fill up a world with a whole bunch of interesting characters. But if you can build a couple and then start to build characters around those characters, you can really start to flesh out a scene. There are a bunch of basic steps that help make this easier, and that's what we're going over today. So, here are the steps. At least the steps I chose to outline for you. There are a couple of other little minor ones. There's always ways to improve on any method. But start, in my opinion, start with building your character's goals and motivations. We talk about the question, what is the meaning of life? And the answer to that, however people choose to answer that, are our motivations. Why am I here? What's my purpose? Any sentient life will ask that question, and you should treat your character like sentient life. Beyond that, there are always things that get in the way of our goals and motivations, our external and internal conflicts. We have our strengths and our flaws that help us either help make that easier to overcome or make it more difficult to overcome. Finally, after that, we're going to talk about static and dynamic characters. Characters that are always the same no matter what, and characters that change the same way the tides do. Finally, we'll talk about developing backstory and developing the physical traits of our person, which I consider kind of final steps. Then, in my opinion, the most important step in developing a character is taking all this beautiful stuff you just wrote and really messing it up, because no one's perfect. And the biggest sin you can commit is making a character that is too perfect. So let's get into it. Goals and motivations. We ask, what do our characters want? There are two main kinds of goals. There are story goals and there are personal goals. Story goals rely directly on the plot that your character is involved in. It's the world around them that creates those goals. Personal goals typically exist outside of the story. If they weren't involved in this adventure, they'd still have that goal in mind. So think of, if you're writing a space pirate character, let's say, their personal goal might be just to retire a wealthy man, to get all the treasure they can and finally be out of the game and just relax. But the story goal might be to find this one very specific treasure that a map led them to. Without the story, without the map, without all these things contributing to their life, this goal wouldn't exist, but they'd still want to be a rich person. Story goals typically modify personal goals and vice versa. As a character moves through a story, their personal goals either get in the way or help contribute, and those interactions can adjust those goals. So, as an example, in A New Hope, the first Star Wars movie, Luke Skywalker's character goal is not, he doesn't want to destroy the Death Star, he doesn't want to save Princess Leia, he doesn't even want to become a Jedi. None of that matters to him until the story comes to him and starts affecting his life. Luke's goal at the very beginning of the story and kind of all throughout is he doesn't want to be a moisture farmer. He wants to leave Tatooine. He wants to join his friends as part of the Rebel Alliance. He wants to join Biggs up in the stars. That's what he wants. He wants to stop being in his own perspective, he wants to stop being a loser on a desert planet and wants to go fight the Empire. He doesn't know the Death Star exists. He doesn't know Princess Leia needs to be saved. He doesn't know that his father was a Jedi. Never mind, he doesn't know Obi-Wan or Old Ben's a Jedi. Never mind, he may not even know Jedi really exist, or he thinks of them as a myth. All of those things become reality as the story approaches him. Luke's goals change and he rises to the challenges that appear before him. And that's where all the other qualities of his character really come through. It's his strengths and his flaws that really develop how he works with the plot to achieve his goals. A lot of the goals aren't even met until later movies. This is directly a quote from the first movie. He wants to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like his father. He says that toward the end of the movie, he's not a proper Jedi until the third movie that was made. His first first teacher is killed in front of his very eyes. The second teacher, he has to go out to the far reaches of the Outer Rim to a swamp planet to find this little green guy to teach him. There's a lot of things that get in his way, and that's what makes the story so interesting, is these goals. It's not just a simple matter of go do one task and your goal's accomplished. And that's really what fleshes out a goal. Here are some tips, though, when first developing a character. Keep your goals small and specific. Keep them specific to this one person. You don't need their goal to be the big story goal. Make their goal something like, hey, if you really want to see a character goal turn into a story goal, take a police officer character who's hungry for a sandwich, let's say in New York. He leaves the precinct, goes to grab a dirty water dog on the street, and sees a criminal running away with a purse. That's how you turn a character goal, being hungry, into a story goal, catching the criminal who's running away. And all that's this tiny little microcosm of one goal being achieved. I always recommend focusing on personal goals. That's what fleshes out a character. Story goals flesh out a story, and they'll come as you write the rest of your script, your treatment, your novel. Always ask how your character is dissatisfied. Once you're done building your character, say, okay, now they hate their life. What about their life do they hate? And where can I fit goals in that? Make your goals intrinsic to the plot. As your plot develops, make sure that your goals, your character's goals, and the story goals kind of run together or run against each other. This is how you weave a character into a plot without it feeling like you're just dropping them in there. A lot of good goals are really self-destructive. If someone plays a drug addict, their goal is to do drugs. Or if a character is a drug addict, their goal is to do drugs. That harms them. They're not trying to necessarily turn themselves into a model citizen. And not all characters are. Not all characters are Superman, remember? Some people just want to live life to the fullest. Some people just want to die. There's all sorts of complex characters you can develop. Don't make everyone just a Superman. Don't make everyone perfect. As far as creating new goals, characters being told the truth and characters being lied to both create goals. If Luke were lied to about Princess Leia being on the ship, he'd still have the goal of rescuing Princess Leia. It just changes the plot. So, let's move on to conflict. Hello, I'm going to say Kieran. Thank you for joining my class. We're learning about how to develop characters. So, moving on to conflict. Much like character goals, there are two types of conflict, external and internal. External conflict, this is a lot of words. External conflict basically is beyond your character. It has to do with something else, an external force of some sort. It can be a character, it can be nature, it could be some part of society. And this kind of conflict really develops into physical action more often than not. Internal conflict, however, is all primarily within your character's head. It's overcoming a doubt, a fear, staying true to one's beliefs, becoming a better person through struggle. Internal conflict really makes a character look at themselves, or look to other characters through conversation, through development, through emotion for resolution, rather than a physical fight. A really good way to think of this is your character is going to have their beliefs. They're going to have their goals. They're going to have those things about the universe or about themselves that they know are true. Internal conflict comes when they suddenly have to ask the question, well, is it true? If they have to ask that, you're probably developing a good internal conflict. Stories that are heavy in external conflict are considered plot-driven. That's fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, mystery, thriller. I could go on. Action movies. Internal conflict creates character-driven stories. It's mostly about the dialogue, the communication, your actor's motivations. Romances, literary fiction, dramas are very character driven. So there are all sorts of examples of both external and internal conflict. I grabbed a few basic ones. We have, pardon it being man versus man, person versus person. It's basically someone else stands in your character's way and they have to get past them. This could be through a fight, but it could also be very similar to, let's say, Sherlock Holmes, who, outside of one novel, doesn't fight Moriarty. They try to outwit each other. So they don't necessarily have to throw up the dukes to be in conflict with each other. Then we have man versus nature. This is one of my favorite ones. That actually, the best example I can think of is there's a scene in the Iliad, the story of the Greek invasion of Troy, wherein Achilles is fighting a river, literally fighting a river, and the reason a river is used as the conflict is because it's meant to represent the gods. In this case, the god Poseidon standing in his way. It's a way to show that a character is being fought by the universe, by God, by fate, by the greater powers that transcend human beings. When we want to show that, we do things like fires, floods, storms, tornado, hurricane, you name it. Next up, we have Man vs. Society, which is a classic like dystopian novel, sci-fi kind of vibe. It's the idea that the protagonist is trapped or paranoid. There's something wrong with the world around them that they see needs to be fixed, but everyone looks at them like they're crazy. It's often things like secret societies, conspiracy theories, governments, religion, all of these, the idea of these greater powers having been corrupted and standing in a character's way. A really good example of this is Da Vinci Code. Also, like, half the spy films out there turn out to be, oh, well, turns out your team is actually the bad team. Think Avengers, with the whole SHIELD is actually, why is it escaping my brain? SHIELD is actually Hydra in disguise. Like, that's man versus society. Everything you knew, the entire system you stand upon, turns out to be against you. Man versus technology, very common in sci-fi. It's basically technology turned bad. Man has to fight technology. It's often results in a worst case scenario in like an apocalyptic thing. Think Terminator. But it can be something as simple as practically any episode of Black Mirror. Any episode of Black Mirror pretty much is an example of man versus technology as a theme. It's taking one idea of technology and twisting it so that it's bad, and then using that as a plot. Finally, we have man versus animal. And when we say man versus animal, it could be The Revenant, where it's Leonardo DiCaprio's character fighting a literal bear. Or it could be something like Beowulf or The Odyssey, where a character fights a beast, a creature beyond them. And this is often used to symbolize good and evil. Luke versus Darth Vader, Rey versus that tree, Resistance versus Final Order, Finn versus BB-8, Poe versus Chewie. I like the idea of that for man versus beast. Typically, the big thing about man versus beast as a traditional conflict is that the beast is overwhelming and like something we don't really understand, and the man or the character is cunning and brave and has strong wits and knows how to secretly or sneakily defeat them. Think about like the idea of a dragon hunter. You have this big creature that seems unsurmountable, and then you have the smart hero comes in and figures out a way. In fact, that's literally the second book of Beowulf, technically speaking. Third? I can't remember. I haven't read it since like grade 4. grade 5. Internal conflict. Story of Moby Dick. Moby Dick's an amazing example of man. It's kind of a combination of man versus beast and man versus environment, or man versus nature, because Moby Dick is used to represent far greater a thing than just a whale. Moby Dick is used to represent fate just getting in the way of Abad. Abad? Whatever. Ishmael, I think. Again, haven't read that one in forever. The whale is a metaphor for much greater things, but literally it is a man versus animal kind of fight. And it's the sheer force of the whale versus the cunning of Ishmael. Or Abad. Again, still don't remember. Let's look at internal conflict. This is one of my favorites because external conflict makes for great action. It, like, truly great action. Even just picturing scenes from Moby Dick. You have the crashing waves. You have this big... Everything's a metaphor for conflict and struggle and pain and torment. Internal conflict is way more subtle than that. It can be one look in a character's eye summarizes all of those feelings like that. It's a conflict of character. Most of this comes from a character's own mind. Again, like I said, take a fundamental idea that a character holds and challenge it. Whether by something from the plot externally, whether by a new realization a character's had, it doesn't really matter. It's the idea of take the notion of a rich, wealthy, like, stockbroker guy. His life is entirely summarized by the idea that he was successful, he's made money, and his life is safe. It's secure. And then take for one moment the fact that despite all the safety he puts around him, he is diagnosed with, let's say, cancer. Suddenly, all the money in the world doesn't mean anything because his life it's being limited. Everything he thought he had ahead of him disappears. Actually, Bucket List, I think it is, with Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson, I want to say, is a good example of that. It's the idea of how someone perceives the world as rich is suddenly turned on its head because of exactly that, essentially that plot. Once a trigger's shown up, most of the fight is shown in the character's own actions, in their own mentality. In Shakespearean tragedy and comedy, typically tragedy, this would actually be shown in monologues. Sarah, that was a good movie, a very good movie. I haven't seen that one. I don't know where I pulled that one out of because I haven't seen it in years. I might rewatch it. But yeah, so most of the fight is shown in a character's actions nowadays. In the case of theater, especially Shakespearean, that's where you get your soliloquies, your big monologues, to be or not to be. Out damn spot, Lady Macbeth says as she washes blood that isn't there off of her hands. Romeo is more external conflict, or external love. But all the great soliloquies betray some sort of conflict. That's where you see it in Shakespearean poetry more than anything else. In movies, we show it through actions. We don't typically have character monologues in their heads, outside of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, maybe. But internal conflicts can be minor, they can be major. For minor, the cool kid at school worrying that he's unliked is an internal conflict, because he's constantly working to maintain his role as the cool kid and is constantly undermining his own actions with what he thinks. The soldier questioning his entire purpose. He was a good soldier. He went out there. He fought the good fight, and then something traumatic happens in the middle of battle, and suddenly not only is he dealing with PTSD, he's dealing with an entire conflict of self. Well, what does it mean to be a soldier? What does it mean to be a fighter? Is this the right way? That's all internal conflict, and he doesn't have to say any of it, and there's no way to show it through a physical fight. There are a few ways, but most of this is in his change of character that happens as a result. There are all sorts of types of internal conflict: moral, self-image, religious, interpersonal, political, existential, love, you name it. Rogue One is man versus man, because it's a war story. That's just how that goes. It's man versus society in that you have the idea of the rebels versus the Empire, the small guy versus the big guy. Those are the two big ones. War, kind of, it's a broad war is a whole bunch of conflicts at once. Now, if you look to, for example, I forget, is it Jyn? The main character in Rogue One, the woman. Her conflict is with the German imperial officer, who's been basically stalking her family and holding her father hostage. There's all sorts of conflict that comes in there. It is Jyn. Okay, cool. If you look to the assassin, the dude who, the rogue, right? Whose name I also don't forget because I'm terrible with names. But basically her, not love interest, her friend, the one she hugs at the end of the movie. His conflict is internal. His conflict is looking at everything he's done, and having to weigh the terrible things he's done for the sake of rebellion versus the ethics of rebellion, versus is this all worth it? Very similar to the soldier after the traumatic incident. He has internal conflict as much as he may be shooting a stormtrooper. Because again, we're focusing on conflicts within a character, not necessarily within a bigger plot. Even though they do have a lot of parallels. Strength. Moving on from conflicts. It's always important to understand what your character is good at. You need to know who they are. If they're a very smart person, make them smart. If they're a very strong person, make them strong and portray that in the story. Ultimately, what shapes a character's strengths and flaws, at least as the audience sees it, is the goals and conflicts that surround them. If you look to the story, I'll go with the story of Hercules. We saw him pop up. I'll talk about him in a moment. If we look outside of the Disney movie, because again, I'm a classics major, I know the mythological stories. Hercules, he had to perform 12 labors. Basically, the story is that he was enchanted in a fit of rage. He actually killed Megara, his wife, and had to atone for that. He had to make up for that. And they made him do 12 labors. And throughout all of these labors, each of these big, huge challenges that no normal human being could accomplish, his strength is apparent. He has to fight the Nemean lion. This is literally just a fist fight with a lion. He has to... I forget if the Hydra was actually a challenge, but even still, in the movie, he fights the Hydra. That's a challenge of strength. But at the same time, we also know Hercules is cunning, because he had to, at one point, convince Atlas, the man who holds up the world, to do something for him. So he had to hold up the world for Atlas, strength. And then when Atlas returned and said, "Now you can keep doing my job for me," he had to trick Atlas, and that's cunning. That shows that he has brains too. And it's only through these conflicts and goals that we see that. He had to clean out the, I forget the name of the stables, but these giant stables full of horse manure. And rather than digging it all up with a shovel, which was the intended action, he diverts an entire river because he's smart too. He actually had to do an extra challenge because of that, but still. Strengths tend to make a character present in a story. So the guy who, in the action story, in the superhero story, Captain America running in, or the Hulk running in and just destroying everything in front of him, he's present. You know Hulk's there. Easily one of my favorite scenes from the first Avengers movie is once we see Hulk. But it's their flaws that make them human and relatable. I don't relate to the Hulk, except when I'm at my most angry, maybe. I relate to Bruce Banner. I don't relate to Loki being evil. I relate to Loki feeling like he's living in the shadow of Thor. It's the flaws that make someone human. There's no real rule for how many strengths or how many flaws a character should have. I tend to go more strengths than flaws, but I try to make sure that they're all connected. Like I say, often it's a good call to make a strength in one area, a flaw in another. Let's look at that. So Hercules, I'm talking the Disney movie here. Super straightforward. Hercules' strength is literal strength. He can pick up entire marble columns as a kid. This is created through a plot point. That's where that strength comes from. He's the son of not only a god, but the king of gods, Zeus. It also creates a flaw. He's too strong. People aren't able to relate to him. People don't get him. It makes him lonely. He has no friends. He has his family who are kind of afraid of him, and he doesn't have the gods because of an even bigger plot point of having been taken from Mount Olympus. So let's look at his flaw. He's lonely. No one can relate to him, but that's what pushes him to find somewhere to fit in. His parents reveal to him that he has this brooch of Zeus, and so he goes to the temple of Zeus and discovers not only is he a god, but that he can one day return to Mount Olympus if he becomes a true hero. And that becomes his motivation for the entire rest of the movie. So we see here, before I get into the heroism, we see here that the strengths and the flaws not only are created necessarily by the plot, but can also modify the plot. They can create character goals, they can create motivations. And ultimately, the plot of your story is just going to be the motivations and goals of all your main characters. That's what it boils down to. Finally, we look to his heroism. He wants to be a hero, he wants to return to Mount Olympus. It brings out a caring side. He starts to care about Megara, he cares about the people he saves, and that emphasizes his strength, literal strength, and creates a plot point. He cares enough about Megara to risk his own life later on. It also brings out a big-headed side in him. Now that he's not lonely, he's full of ego. So much so that he has fangirls, he has merchandise, and that becomes its own plot point because he loses the friendship of Philoctetes, as a result of both that and his love for Megara. So all of these things modify each other, and it can become this kind of complex network. But ultimately, if you boil it down to your strengths, your flaws, your conflicts, and your goals, if you can boil it down to kind of those 4 points, you have a great foundation for a character. That's where you can start to build a story out of. Because at the end of the day, yes, there are some stories that are created. We come up with the plot and then we build characters around them. There are other stories, like, let's say, Star Wars is a great example. Luke is basically the foundation of the entire story of Star Wars. But even beyond that, if we look to Sherlock Holmes again, every story is built around his character, him and John Watson, and eventually Moriarty. Regardless, let's look at static and dynamic characters. This isn't necessarily a big, you need to write a whole bunch of stuff down section of making a character. It's more just a quick little on-off switch that you choose what side to flick. Static and dynamic characters are two different kinds of characters, but they share everything else in common. Static characters will, in the case of Superman, as my example, Superman will always be brave. He will always be strong. He will always be a superhero. He has been the same since the character was created, albeit in the comics things get a bit more gray. But in the case of the movies, the general public and what they know of the character, he is always Superman. He's always the strong guy. He's always the hero. He always cares about people. Clark Kent, his human side, his alter ego, is really how he grows as the character. That's what really makes him change. The human side of him. Those times where he does deviate from his main character, typically within 1 or 2 comic books, he's back to being himself. Not always, but usually. Let's look at, by contrast, at Harry Potter, a dynamic character. Not only is he dynamic because when we first meet him all the way to the end of the movies, he grows up a whole bunch of years. He's literally gone through school. But he started as a scrawny kid living under a staircase. No one loved him. His family were jerks. At the end of all the movies, he defeats the greatest villain known to existence, apparently. Lord Voldemort. And everything in between is change. He changes not only from one book to another, he'll change multiple times within a book. Sometimes he's faced with challenges to his character, where he goes up against a conflict and loses, which is awesome. That's a really good way to build character. They talk about people talk about when you're making stuff as an artist, in media, in whatever, that the biggest thing you can have that builds your character and builds your experience is failure. It's all great to do perfectly all throughout until you run into a challenge and then you're stuck not knowing how to respond. If your life is a lot of failures that you're learning from, you're able to face more challenges as a result. Harry Potter never goes back to being the scrawny kid living under a staircase. He changes constantly, and that's what this means. Static doesn't change. Dynamic changes. That's all it boils down to. And you get to make the decision as the author as to whether your character changes or not. To go back to Star Wars, for example. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a character that doesn't change. Well, here we go. Emperor Palpatine. Aside from changing physically, his character is always the evil bad guy who wants to destroy everything and take over the universe. He never stops being that. He never starts being a nice guy all of a sudden. Apparently somewhere he had a kid. I don't know where that happened. But he is always the bad guy. Whereas if you look at characters like, Luke changes. He becomes a Jedi. Rey changes. She goes from nobody, much like Luke, nobody to Jedi. Han Solo. Han Solo is a great example of he's a scummy guy. He's part of the underworld. He's a smuggler. He's a thief. He's no good. He literally shoots the bounty. He shoots Greedo first, and anyone who says otherwise is lying, including Disney's new cut of the movie. But by the end of the movie, not by the end of episode 4, by the end of A New Hope, never mind the main storyline, he becomes a hero. He starts to change. And by the end of episode 6, he doesn't want to go back to being a smuggler. That's a dynamic character, and that's a very interesting dynamic character. Backstory. Backstory is kind of the next step. Once you have your main character, this is where you flesh out everything else. It's all about building on a character's existing framework, but leaving them open to further development. You don't want to back them in a corner too much. Keep things simple if you don't want the backstory to conflict with existing info. The more backstory and lore you give a character, the more you have to be careful not to contradict that backstory and lore. Keep things open-ended keep things open-ended and obscure if you want to add more development later. A character doesn't know their parents. Really, with the exception of Rey and kind of Star Wars dropping that ball. not knowing parents is a really good way to suddenly discover in another book, here are my parents. A good example of this is Star-Lord in Marvel, or Peter Quill. First movie, his dad is just a big question mark. And the second movie, our plot is entirely based on who is his dad. Keep things tailored to your character's existing traits if you want to better justify them. Some characters, their backstory is the complete opposite of what they are now. They underwent a big change off screen. They used to be a rich kid, and now they're living on the streets. We might delve back into their backstory, but there's this big change we didn't get to see. If you want to show that a strong superhero is a strong superhero, make their backstory a bunch of them being a strong superhero. Thor is a great example because Thor, both the character in Marvel and the mythological god, Thor as he exists now is big strong guy who's kind of dumb, to be honest. Thor as he existed from now all the way back to his creation was big strong guy who's kind of dumb, especially in mythology. He just doesn't get it. He's basically a big jock. So backstory is a really good way to flesh out your world too without having to incorporate it into your story. The example I use, I just pulled one out of nowhere. If you have a character who grew up as a criminal in the Tokyo underworld, you don't necessarily in your story have to go to the Tokyo underworld. You don't have to show what each of the stores look like. You don't have to show the characters they interacted with. You just know that there's this underworld, and your character's traits are what defines what the underworld is like. Because if they had to survive there, the traits they now use to survive are indicative of how brutal it may have been there. You can do this with any world, of course. Think of practically any of the dwarves in Lord of the Rings, or The Hobbit, or any of that. You barely ever see their society, you just see the traits of the dwarves, and that defines what all dwarves are like. For all we know, Gimli could be nothing like any other dwarf in the world, but we wouldn't know that because he's the only one we see, in the movie at least. Physical traits. Physical traits are simply putting a face to a name. Your general traits shouldn't be super intentional, in my opinion. I don't like the idea of sitting down like my character needs to have specifically this shade of brown hair, specifically this color eyes, like all the general stuff that your character barely thinks of should be pretty free-flowing. Just choose something. If it doesn't work later, fix it. Just make sure you haven't written anything yet. Anything that's unique about them should be accentuated. If, for example, you decide their hair is unique because, let's say Brave, Merida in Brave, she's got flowing, huge red hair. That's a super, super well-defined trait. It helps flesh out her character design, like physically on screen, and it really is a metaphor for her personality too. If you're going to go big with a character trait, go big with it. The biggest rule of thumb is if you're going to do something different, if you're going to make a tweak, don't make it subtle is not useful. To a point, once you start to master the form, subtlety works, but starting off, choose 5 traits and make them super larger than life. And then if you need to dial them back, you can. There's a reason that characters in the pilot of a show look different than they do in season 3. Use some traits to build on your character. It can invite new backstory. Not only can things like Merida's hair be a metaphor for her personality, but things like Harry Potter's scar, Captain Hook's hook, define them as people. They are not only unique to them, but they have to do with where their backstory lies. Use the fine details in your writing and not your development. We don't need to know, again, the very specific shade of hair or the acute angle at which the scar on their face lies. I don't care. Just tell me they have a scar on their face. That's for when someone is very carefully analyzing and studying the face of your character in the book. In the case of the character sheet, for example, that I'm giving you, and we'll see in a moment, I don't need to know all that written out. You don't have that much room to write it all out. You do have room to draw, though, which is pretty cool. And feel free to do so. You use all of these traits, the big ones and the small ones, to leave a quick impression. You want to be able to summarize your character in 30 words or less, so that your audience can be like, yes, I get it. Then you can flesh it out. Once they're on board, you can flesh it out. But starting off, you need to be quick about it. I compare it to, there are a few well-known music producers who use this trick when they're listening to new tracks that they might sign onto a label. They'll pull up the entire list of tracks, they'll play it for 20 seconds. If it hasn't grabbed them in 20 seconds, nope, doesn't make the cut. This leaves a lot of good stuff on the cutting room floor. It also means that they get through quickly, they make an impression quickly, they know their songs that they sign are good and fit the vibe they want. Do the same thing with your characters, or at least the traits. Make sure that they impress in the first 20 seconds, or else no one will be on board for the rest of the book. It's a bit brutal, but it's how it goes. So, next up, my favorite part about characters. We talked about how flaws make a character human. In my opinion, the biggest sin an author can commit is making characters too perfect. I hate Superman. They've done a lot to improve him over the last little while. Superman to me is an example of someone I'd never want to talk with at a party. I'd never want to meet in person. I wouldn't even want him to save me, because he's just so milquetoast and boring and perfect. That little curly Q on his forehead, no thank you. Give me Iron Man. Iron Man's got edge to him. Never mind, like, he has a history of alcoholism. Like, he's got all these internal conflicts, but he doesn't care. He's just there for a party. Give me Batman. He's a bit brooding. He's a bit morose, but Batman has all this literal shadow around him that makes him interesting. All sorts of characters are great examples of this. If you gave me a second, I could go on and on and on. Most awesome characters out there have imperfections all over the place. I'm kind of the same way with Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes to me is someone who's a bit too perfect. The only thing that makes him interesting to me is Moriarty is his antithesis. You have two perfect beings going up against each other at the same time. But I much rather care about Watson's perspective because he's a normal human being, interpreting everything. Green Lantern, are we using that as an example of perfect or imperfect? I'm not very familiar with Green Lantern, to be honest. While I'm waiting on that. So, we make a perfect character. Your job is to scuff them up. Your job is to take sandpaper to their face and mess them up. Your job is to take sandpaper to their fundamental traits, their personality, and scuff it up. In the case of some characters, especially heroes, you need to break them. Like, properly break them. The way I write it, give them trauma, give them tragedy, give them sorrow, give them something to hate about existence. Give them a reason to not want to live, and then force them to live for another reason. Like, really be cruel to your characters, and it's going to feel awful, it'll feel mean, and it is, and I love it. For example, take something you like about your character. To be honest, he has more of the perfect guy, like really ironic, just got trying to fight the Yellow Lantern. Yeah, Green Lantern never grabbed me, especially the whole like different colors of lantern cores. Like, it's not my jam. Yeah, so take something you love about your character, like you've written it out, and take the one thing that's like, yeah, when I wrote that, I was so happy I wrote it down, erase it. Then figure out how getting rid of that thing impacts your character's life. And then write your character to fit that new description. So if your character, for example, Bruce Wayne. Like Bruce Wayne starting out, when we first see him, albeit he was written as Batman and then given a backstory. Bruce Wayne had loving parents, a rich upbringing, a wonderful life as a kid, and then his parents were shot in front of him and he had to cope with that. That's a good way to break a character. It's a bit played out now, the dead parents thing, it's been used a lot of times. But another, if we're going with the dead parents, another good example there is Lilo and Stitch. Watch that movie and see just the subtle little bits of trauma that go through Nani and Lilo's life. See how losing their parents really impacted them. Because it's honestly fairly apparent. That's a good way to build a character. Or take the character of Nani, for example. That's a character you wrote and you really want to make an edgy story, not a Disney movie. Take Lilo away from her. She didn't necessarily die. Maybe she was taken by Child Protective Services. Who knows? But that's going to impact how Nani's perspective is changed, how her personality is shaped, what makes her her. If we were making like an edgy kind of drama, that's a really good way to modify her character. Again, it's mean, but adversity builds character. Struggling through terrible stuff builds character. I'll say the same thing about everything going on right now with the pandemic. Us dealing with this makes us better at what we're doing. You guys will be better able to cope with situations like this when it comes to your learning, when it comes to how you're going to live your lives. People who work in hospitals are going to be better equipped to cope with something like this. I myself, my teaching has improved, in my opinion, because of this. It's just a silver lining. It's still a tragedy that all this is going on, but that's a way to build character. Call that a silver lining, that you get to build character from tragedy. Moving on, though. So other tips. Just a general list of other tips. One sec. Yeah, that's fine. Avoid cliches wherever possible. Dead parents is a good example. But even in writing your character, you're going to start using adjectives for them, words that describe them. Be careful about using cliches. Strong as an ox. What's that even mean? Try so strong he threw a boulder 15 kilometers away. It's more specific. It's more detailed. It's more interesting than strong as an ox. Always try to challenge your character with side characters. In the case of this assignment, it's not super relevant, but when you're writing bigger stories, Sherlock's biggest challenge is that Watson doesn't understand him, doesn't get him, doesn't understand how his brain works. Make your characters fail. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Failure builds character. Make your character face their challenge and lose. It may not be the biggest challenge. It may not be the big plot point in the story. It may just be a small thing related to a character goal rather than a story goal. But make them fail at it. Make them wallow for a little bit and then come back better. Or come back worse. That's also interesting. Give them some sort of refuge, though. With Iron Man, for example, who, like his character Tony Stark, suffers from alcoholism, his refuge is drinking. His refuge is partying. His refuge is picking up women before he meets Pepper Potts. That's where he can just be him. He doesn't have to worry about the demons in his head, and he doesn't have to worry about fighting off aliens or other supervillains. That's where he can just be him. Same with Batman, for example. I'm sticking with superheroes at this point. Batman's refuge is fighting crime. Batman's refuge is the idea that he doesn't like being, not necessarily alive, but he doesn't like where his head's at. His trauma, his tragedy, his lonely life, that has to be lonely because he fights crime. Like, all of that is weighing on him, and his refuge is being able to go out there and just kick some bad guy butt. Draw from real life experiences. It doesn't have to be from your own life. But take examples from real life, especially if you're doing something that's more realistic and not so sensational. Research. Research is a big one. Research your backstories, research your plots, research your character traits. Make sure you know every answer to every question you might want to ask about your character. You don't have to do this while developing your character right off the start. You do this as you flesh out your character, as you write, as you create. But knowing the little details is what's going to make your character feel real. Another good piece of advice is be the little voice in your character's head. When your character comes up against a challenge, you need to be their Jiminy Cricket, their conscience, that little voice of instinct that says, here's what you would do. The challenge is being able to be that and then write them in a way that doesn't feel like they're always following that. Because not everyone does. So we're all going to write a too perfect version of our character. Then we're going to mess it up. I guarantee you will do it. If you feel like you haven't done it, then you need to mess up your character. Use that too perfect version as what your character wants to be. So if it's a matter of the mess up is that someone major in their life died, their ideal life is that that person never died and they could just live life happy. If it's that the character, let's say you physically mess them up, you take away both of their arms, now like prosthetic arms. Their ideal self may be, I wish I had arms again. Let that be the ideal self. There's all sorts of emotional ways you can scuff them up too. Kill your darlings. And this is a piece of advice that I will use for everything. Whether you're doing video, whether you're doing character design, whether you're writing a plot. If it's something you really, really love, but it's in the way of progress in your story, in your work, in your creation, get rid of it. Yes, you could get rid of it and throw it in another Word document. You may use it later. More often than not, when I do that, I find I never use it again. Kill your darlings. In the case of journalism, when I've written stories, I might go over my word count. I might write a 400-word story for a 300-word story. Like, go over by 100. That's where you kill that sentence is fatty. That sentence doesn't mean anything. I can't confirm that sentence. It's bias. They may be great sentences. It may be beautiful writing, but it means nothing if it gets in the way of the final goal. At least within writing. So, those are my big tips for you. Next up, we've got your character sheet assignment, which I think is pretty awesome. Let's quick run through it. So, I have a description here. I'll pull up the description on Canvas after this. This assignment's super straightforward. I have given you a character sheet with appropriate info for a character of your design. Just a new character out of nowhere. I need you to fill it out, or at least fill out the main sections, which I'll indicate in a moment. If you need to add more info, feel free to submit it with... sorry, I didn't mean reflection here. Feel free to submit it with your sheet on like a Word document, or write it out and send a photo. You'll get more info in a second. There are extra spaces, like physical descriptions, space to draw your character. These aren't mandatory, but feel free to like really get into this if you want to. Like if you have a great idea for a character, I'd love to see it. So, in summary, before I quick pull up that assignment again. Character is created through a balance of goals and conflicts. You build your character from a whole bunch of little pieces that all come together. And you should never make your character too perfect. For every for as many strengths as you have, you need flaws. That's what makes your character human. So, backing out of that, let's look at the character sheet. Spent a bit of time photoshopping this. So I have multiple different sections here. Let's fix there we go. Up top, we have your character name, your own student name. And I want the genre question here. Okay, does it actually have to be a real character? Isn't self-made, or can I use a thing, not a person, or actual character or an actual character virtual object? I'm not sure I exactly understand your question. I want this to be a unique idea of your own, whatever character it is. They don't have to be a human being. They don't have to be a person in a real world scenario. It doesn't have to be a stockbroker. You could do a space pirate in the year 2017. It looks like the D&D Beyond sheet. Yeah, this I took the original, the standard. Sorry, my D&D book's my mouse pad. Yeah, I took the standard D&D character sheet and just photoshopped it into something that kind of fit our purposes. So we have your character name, your student name, and I want a story genre. If you're doing a drama or an action in a real world, I want you to say that. If you're doing a sci-fi novel, I want you to write that. I do want you to indicate whether they're a hero or a villain or something else. They could be something that doesn't fall in either category. The areas I want you to fill out, no matter what, are strengths. I want you to put at least a couple of strengths. So write down what the strength is in the description. I want you to fill out a couple of flaws. I want you to give me some goals or motives. And I want you to give me some conflicts and indicate whether they're internal or external. Fill out some backstory. Again, you don't have to fill these to the brim. I just want enough info to go off of to have an idea of your character. Then again, we have any physical traits, your character appearance. Let me pull up the description on Canvas. It is not that. Okay. So, again, fill out your character sheet. 6 mandatory sections. Need you to fill out the upper section just so I know whose assignment it is. And all of that. Strengths, flaws, motives and goals, conflicts, and backstory. Armed with the knowledge from class. Basically, I pretty much want you to do what we've just gone over in the lecture. And I really encourage you to make something that's different, interesting, something you can be proud of, something that's you. Not the character you, but something that feels like it was made by you and is very unique. Because I really don't want to mark 10 different versions of some generic person going about their life in generic New York. It would be very upsetting to me, especially knowing that a few of you guys like D&D. As far as submitting the assignment, I need a digital copy of your sheet. Whether you print it out and take a photo, whether you scan it to your computer, you could pull up the image on your tablet and fill in all the info on there. As long as it's all legible, as long as I can see what you've written and understand it. If you do go above and beyond, wish to add more to your character, so other stuff you might want to talk about, if you run out of room in a section, feel free to submit any extra info as a Word document or as a photo, again legible. Just make sure to indicate what section any info goes in, because I don't want to accidentally mistake something as a strength when it's a flaw. For example, so assignments were 20% of your grade. I do look forward to seeing your finished characters. I put a fair bit of love into this assignment, and I'm hoping you guys will deliver. And then at the end of this description on Canvas, there is a link to the file. If we go on Canvas and look at the modules, there's a link as well under assignments and tests, and one under under this week's folder as well. Character creation assignment, which is where you'll submit, and the PDF, which is the file for the character sheet. Do we have any questions about the assignment, about the lesson, about things going forward? I'll give it 1 second. Also, I do really encourage those who tuned in late. I encourage you go onto Canvas and check out the news stories, especially the Kung Fu Nuns, because it is so cool. There is part of me that wishes I could become a Kung Fu Nun in Nepal. Unfortunately, there are a few qualities I lack. But those are all also on Canvas. I've been putting good news every week. So, one last time, are there any questions? Speak now or, well, email me later. I'm going to pop that back up. I'm not seeing any. Oh, wait, there we go. Can we put our character in a world that already exists, for example, Game of Thrones? Absolutely. Please just indicate that in your story genre. And yeah, like, assuming they are a totally new person, and please be aware I've read the books, so not that I expect you to cheat, because it'd be way more effort to cheat than it would be to just write a character. But yeah, like, if you want to set your character in the world of Batman, in the world of Gotham, write story genre Gotham. Just indicate movie or comic. Same with Game of Thrones. Yeah, like, it really, you have, the only thing that's restricting you here is that you need to fill out the sections that you need to fill out. Beyond that, the creativity side of things, that's all your domain. Feel free to go ham with it. That said, also, please remember that there are some outlying other assignments. I still need to receive a few script assignments and a few photo essays. So please try to get those done too. I believe I've received 1 or 2 photo essays, and just quickly looking over them, I'm already enjoying that assignment. I also marked your first assignment, your story pitch assignments, those ones that I have received, and those marks are on Canvas. It's still open to submit if you have an assignment that's outlying. But yeah, those who have submitted finally have a mark in. Sorry for the delay in that. Okay, off topic. The new Obi-Wan show that's coming out. What do you think? 1 sec, my music died on me. I don't know why it keeps doing that. That's coming out. When do you think it's going to take place? Right after episode 3, the middle between New Hope. I'm hoping it takes place like not while he's exiled, but while he's exiled. I'd love to see what Yoda did during that time as well. God, I'm delving into... Before I delve into any more Star Wars talk, anyone who doesn't want to do Star Wars talk, that's about the end of class, and thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing your assignments, and we'll be back again next week. Unless anything changes, I'm thinking of teaching you a bit about photojournalism. But that's not quite set in stone. We'll see what we go with. If you have any ideas, feel free to shout them out in chat. With that, let's talk Star Wars. Yeah, I really hope to see it after Order 66. Because I've already seen enough of Obi-Wan pre-episode 3, like the Clone Wars, mostly because I've been rewatching it like a fiend. And really, there's not much more of his story to tell outside of that. I'd also love to see what Qui-Gon Jinn did pre-Phantom Menace. Like, there's so many different paths you could take, but really, I will never be satisfied until Star Wars delves into the story of Darth Revan, or the Mandalorian Wars. Either one, I'd be happy. But Darth Revan and the whole like Grey Jedi thing. Especially because I already got rid of my favorite character, Mara Jade. I just hope we see more. I'd love to see Ahsoka again. She's another one of my favorite characters. Honestly, the entire world that they built, with Clone Wars is amazing. Another thing, just while I've got y'all here, those who haven't taken off and wanted to hear about Star Wars, I'm also going to, as per always, kind of plug every Wednesday, so every yesterday, at 5, I've been doing a more casual stream. Just kind of chilling, chatting, and I've been mostly teaching photo editing, but plan to start teaching video editing skills as well, just random stuff that comes up. I highly recommend, if you want to go back to my YouTube and check them out, cool. But if not, I do recommend you tune in on Wednesdays, because it's a fairly fun time and it's a really good way to get some practice on some of these skills while everything's going on. So just figured I'd drop that one. Same link as this, just every Wednesday at 5. Can't wait to see her aging too. We never see how she... Yeah, ages since Rebels. Rebels wasn't my jam. I don't know why it was. Rebels didn't grab me so much. Maybe it's the nostalgia of Clone Wars. Okay, this is where I change genre. There we go. Hopefully that doesn't pause on me. But yeah, I've got another 10 minutes, so I'm happy to talk about Star Wars or any other questions, because I am still a teacher. Any other questions about assignments? But for those who don't want to chat Star Wars, feel free to tune out. No problem. Yeah, Rebels. I see where they were going with it, but it reminded me more of the Ewoks show from way back when than it did Clone Wars for some reason. It's just a bit too light, even though it wasn't that light. Leave it at that. And let's switch over to Cam. There we go. Yeah, I don't know. All the third trilogy is it. I like where they tried to go, but they was all the casting issues, or not casting issues, but the personnel issues that really affects a show or a movie like that or a series like that. What I am excited for is, for those who aren't aware, Taika Waititi is confirmed to be directing the next Star Wars picture. Yeah, I agree. Last Jedi, it tried. It was good bits broken up by a lot of boring, useless stuff. I feel like the editor's floor was left with a lot of they made the wrong decisions there. But we'll see one day, maybe. Oh, the only other note I'll leave as far as that stream on Wednesdays. If you are interested in that, you can feel free to follow the account, and you'll receive updates as far as when I go live with it. I do really encourage you to check it out because, again, it's a lot of digital skills that I may not be able to cover in this class because it doesn't necessarily fit with what we're discussing as far as this class goes. So hopefully it'll be able to kind of fill that gap. There we go. Good, my music is not pausing this time. Who all do we still have in here? Still have a whole list of people logged in. But yeah, I'm gonna leave the Star Wars chat at that. Oh. Seeing ways, powers on screen first time. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Feel free to keep chatting in the chat. Once I log off, it doesn't mean that everything closes down. But thank you all for joining me. I will see you next week. Hopefully on Wednesday, definitely on Thursday. Stay safe, stay informed, and wash your hands. And I hope you guys have a good one.